Welcome to another Samso special event where we talk to companies about what they're doing in regards to the process, just something different from the Coffee with Samso series. I've got Blackstone Minerals here today talking with Anna Cranney about a very important topic, the whole concept of ESG. Anna's role in the company is to sort of facilitate that part of the process. Anna, welcome to Samso.
Thanks, Noel. Thanks for having me. I'm very delighted to be here.
I guess it's a very sort of a topical three letters, and it's easily understood and misunderstood. Let maybe start with just letting us know what's your role at Blackstone.
Yeah, sure. So I've been on board with Blackstone for about 3 months now, and I guess, as you say, ESG, environmental, social, corporate governance, is such a broad topic, so you have to be a bit of a multitasker in what you know and what you do. But I love that because, you know, when you're working for a company like Blackstone, we often talk about being agile, and you need to pick up one hat and then put that down and put another hat on. So my role really is to embed ESG and you know, our credentials around ESG early in the company. So we're in this development stage. We're looking toward construction and you know, and then processing as well. So you know, it's an exciting time to be part of a company because I think a lot of companies will engage someone, you know, with my skill set or my role a little later in the piece, perhaps when there's been some sort of catastrophe or some sort of problem. So, and really it's about good risk management and good governance, engaging someone early to anticipate what the challenges might be and address them.
I think that last statement's very important because, you know, of late we've seen a few sort of catastrophes in terms of ESG, and you sort of wonder how that could have happened. So from Blackstone's point of view, obviously they're moving into that complicated mining and things like that. How do you start that process?
Yeah, great question. So I asked myself the same thing when I began.
Don't tell Scotty that.
No. Where do you begin? Because there's so much you could do. And really it's about listening to your stakeholders. And first and foremost, that's the community that we're operating in. So around Ban Phuc, in the Muang Kwa commune in northern Vietnam. It's really important to hear what they have to say. We've got an interesting story because we have an existing mine that we've taken over, and so with that comes a certain legacy and a certain perception from the community and expectations from the community. So I think you know, it's important to go in and listen to them, not set expectations beyond what's achievable. So be really realistic and honest and engage early. And then beyond the community, I think certainly the way that I kind of got engaged and I'm interested myself in ESG is looking at the shareholders and what their expectations are around good governance, around environmental compliance and performance, and around how they're treating those community members. So we spoke to them as well, whether they be institutional investors, who are very literate and proactive, or whether they're retail investors that might just have one thing that, as you say, has been triggered by a certain event in the news, and they start asking questions like, well, what are they doing about tailings? What are Blackstone doing about tailings? Or, you know, what are Blackstone doing about training local people rather than just flying in expats all the time to run the mine or the processing facility? So that's certainly been the most important first step. And then, you know, we start to, once we've developed those understandings from those different groups and from our employees as well, that's also important because I think there's a bit of a war on talent at the moment, certainly in Western Australia in the mining industry, but to engage people like myself, but also our chemical engineers, our people who are even, people who are running, I don't know, investor relations and things like that. They want to know what the hook is for them. And more often than not at the moment, it's around ESG and company commitments and integrity. So we talk to employees as well. And then I guess the next step for us where we're at right now is setting the expectations, the metrics and what we're hoping to achieve. But we have to do that in partnership with those groups. So we need to take what we've learnt from them in that first stage, and as we move into the second stage of, okay, well, this is what we want to achieve, these are our priorities. We need to be talking to the community about, how many people we're going to employ, what sort of pathways we're putting them on. And similarly, understanding from the OEMs who will be the end user of our product, what are their expectations around carbon emissions, human rights associated with the production of our product.
When it's interesting, I mean, as you were talking about, the employees and what's their hook, I think more and more that is more important has moved up the list on top of I want to be paid this amount of money.
Yeah.
And obviously they want to part of the long life of their job is that you're at that forefront of ESG and your product is sort of ESG. So when you look at ESG, do you look at three letters? How do you go E is better than S or S is better than G, or which one first, or is it a whichever sort of fire lights up, how do you figure it out, I guess?
Yeah, so I don't think there's a hierarchy because I think all are important for good governance and risk management in a business. But I think things change over time. So, I mentioned a lot of the engagement we did with our stakeholders, whether they be retail investors or, the sustainability lead for a large institutional investment firm, or, the local trade union representative in the community that we're operating in. All of them will come with different priorities, but actually it's quite remarkable the crossover. So, and they might just be articulated in a different way by those different groups. And I think too, we're in development stage at the moment, so things like anti-bribery and corruption from a governance perspective is really important to demonstrate we're operating with integrity and in that jurisdiction. As we go through permitting and processes like that. But people are already flagging that environmental protection, whether that be the water that we're using and the community saying, it gets quite dry at this time of year, or, we're concerned around pollution, whereas an institutional investor might say a similar thing, but they'll just articulate it in a different way, I guess. So being able to collate all of that is really important, and you start to build a broad picture of where we need to focus right now. But that might change as we move into construction and then, mining operations and then the refinery as well. There'll be other things that come up that we need to be agile and adapt to. So we're quite conscious of that. And not just, I guess, the expectations of those stakeholders, but we need to think about what else is coming, because in 5 years' time, there might be something else that's just as important.
Yeah, I guess, in the scheme of things, when you look at the ESG, it's very different where you are, which one's going to crop up more than the other. I had a conversation with previous guys on Coffee Samso, and I made this comment that, in Australia, maybe because we've sort of been very E-orientated, the G part of it's pretty straightforward, right? We don't have much of a G issue. Whereas if you go to another jurisdiction, you may have a lot of G issue, and E is very lacking, and all this. So when we talk about Blackstone Vietnam, which component, or how do you describe each component?
Yeah, sure. So I guess environmentally, somewhat similar to Australia in that there's very clear steps and phases about what we need to meet from an environmental compliance perspective. So we're about to start quite a large environmental impact assessment process conducted by both local consultants from the area, but also a larger international consultancy. And so with that, I think that's quite important because they understand the local context and government and the various levels and phases of that process. But they're also bringing the international expectations, whether they be an understanding around what's coming in terms of climate change and how we need to respond to that. Socially, some of the things that we're quite cognizant of in Vietnam are things like human rights and meeting the human rights expectations of the community first and foremost, but also our investors. They will ask pointed questions if we are, not addressing things like safety at work, not providing people with PPE, not actually making a commitment to the community about training local people, not just putting them in a role that stays at a certain level over the life of our operations, but actually provides a pathway and a career for local people. We've got a number in the area we're in, there's a number of ethnic minorities that are represented that aren't represented in other areas of Vietnam. And typically in Vietnam, great success story in terms of economic development over the past few decades. And so you would assume then that socioeconomic levels of those different ethnic minorities would have increased, but we still see challenges in terms of health and education and the prosperity of those groups. So, that's a really unique opportunity for Blackstone to be able to contribute to those groups, and the majority of our employees on site hail from those ethnic minorities already, and I just see our role is to strengthen that and to provide more opportunities to them. And then finally, from a governance perspective, as I mentioned earlier, anti-bribery and corruption is front of mind for us, and we're lucky, I think. ESG, when it's done well, is done in partnership with other groups. I can't do it all by myself. Blackstone can't solve all these problems by ourselves. So we've got to tap into the right people, and that takes some time to listen and understand who are the best people to be talking to. And for me, coming from a not-for-profit background and an international NGO background, I see real expertise and skill in those areas. And so if we can tap in and partner with groups like that who have a really good understanding of what works, what are the risks in terms of anti-bribery and corruption in Vietnam, then we're well placed to respond to it. I'd say the other piece is around covering both governance and the social performance side is around modern day slavery and worker rights. Not just for our immediate workers, but also across our supply chain. And when we start to talk to OEMs, that's what they're really interested in, is what are the risks in terms of the supply chain. Blackstone's down here, we're wanting to supply to a Tesla or a BMW. They're very clear and coherent about what their expectations are from a slavery perspective and child labour, because they've been burnt in the past. So that's where I think it's really good from a Blackstone perspective. We are being proactive about it and looking at how to communicate what we're doing already, because not that we've had to address those risks, but we need to be clear that we've already built into our recruitment policies, that we're complying with Vietnamese labour law, people are being paid fairly. Important part of that is communicating how we're governing those risks, I guess.
So it's become part of the business, so to speak.
Yeah.
When those side of the conversation, people, ESG, there's two parts of here. One is that a lot of people may think ESG is environmental, let's just be good.
Yeah.
And then the second part is when the same guys say, oh yeah, ESG, you guys are just playing the compliance game, and it's just a compliance thing, so how do you respond to those comments? If it was, some may have that thought, some don't, but yeah.
Yeah, so I guess for regular viewers, you would have seen Scotty Williamson's very passionate about incorporating ESG, not just into the story of Blackstone, but into the complete structure of the company. And I think, a really good indicator, as I mentioned earlier, is how early a role like mine has been engaged. For a junior company, that's fairly unprecedented, and often it might be because there's certain levels of permitting that need to be done that require some ESG or enviro input into that process. But I think having people that, not just my role, but recruiting people that have that mindset that ESG is part of our DNA at Blackstone helps us make more informed decisions, because you're not just recruiting a geologist that's focused just on drill holes and the results of that, but you're actually recruiting a geologist that's mindful of, okay, well, that's close to this community, how can we plan to work around this time? So you're getting people that are more receptive and responsive to some of those considerations that, I think moves beyond a compliance piece, so to speak. And ultimately, if ESG is done well in a company, there shouldn't be a need for a role like mine, because if I'm doing my job well, I need to do myself out of a job and get everyone to own it in the company, not just in the corporate office too. It's just as important on site in our Hanoi office that everyone understands what our approach is, what our philosophy is to community, to environmental performance, and to how we manage our business. It's not just reserved for the corporate team and the board.
I think in some sense, when we talk about ESG, a lot of people still think it's a one lump thing. It's something, it should be right, but it's actually now needs to be required to be built into the business. Like you're saying, it needs to be embedded into the DNA of the company, because the whole business stream is now like that. So they drill, as much as we're drilling down to having the DNA of ESG, the top end, the retail side is drilling down into their DNA that this should be in the DNA of the whole flow, right?
Yeah.
So the importance is a lot more than we feel.
Yeah, and I kind of liken it to how I started investing myself. So I was looking, I was an absolute novice. I'm still pretty green in my own personal investing, but I looked for managed funds that were had responsible kind of metrics attached to it. But then I thought, well, how can I have a really big impact myself personally? And it's, me, little old Anna Cranney, sitting here in Perth, who can seek out, because that information is becoming more and more available through Google, through Twitter, looking at how companies engage and tell their ESG story. I can, now I think, well, where is my money best placed for the next 5, 7, 10 years, given what I know is happening in terms of climate change, human rights, things like that. And I think that's, something that junior mining companies and people that are working in sort of the battery minerals area can take heart. I mean, there's a whole another story attached to it, and a whole group of people that's essentially untapped. You just need to communicate that message and let people know what your commitments are, and that you've got integrity around, you'll actually do what you say you're going to do.
I think that's important. So from your eyes, how do you see ESG 2 years ago, today, 5 years, 10 years?
Yeah. So 2 years ago, it wasn't the catchphrase that it is now, and I think there's been a few events that have kind of solidified that language, certainly amongst resources industry. There's been absolute tragedies attached to mining companies in Australia and abroad that has really shone a light on, well, what's good ESG practice? What does it actually look like beyond the corporate social responsibility spin? What's actually happening on the ground? And a company can have all the policies they like and a sustainability section on their website, but to really, I guess, understand what's occurring, you need to ask the right questions and ensure that they are working in partnership with different groups and have allegiances to the right peak bodies or advocacy groups on the ground. And so fast forward to today, I think there's a lot of talk now around climate change, and the climate change conference is happening in Glasgow later this year, where really we're going to see the screws tightened on companies in terms of meeting expectations around carbon emissions, making a commitment. But with that, I think that there'll be increased literacy then amongst mining companies and their expectations. And then with that, I think there'll be greater clarity around other aspects of ESG. So I think what's coming is a focus on biodiversity, and we're right in the midst of that now, Noel, because we're looking at, okay, well, if we build our refinery here, what's the impact on the biodiversity count, I guess, in the area that we're proposing, and is there a better place to do that? So that's something we know is coming. So we've got the luxury, we're not tied to legacy equipment or facilities. We've got the luxury of being able to make informed decisions now. And I think what else is coming is looking at how we use our facilities and understand the resources that are used to construct our plant and expanding our mining operation, understanding where those resources are coming from, how they're made, but also where the feedstock's coming from. Are they complying to the same standards we expect? And OEMs are already flagging this, that they, while it may not be a deal breaker in terms of compliance right now, most suppliers into those car manufacturers will need to be able to track all along their supply chain to make sure that carbon emissions are addressed, worker rights are, transparent and they're met. We're fortunate that we can be a bit more forward-looking because we're not tied to a lot of what other companies are that have been around for a lot longer.
Yeah, I think that's very, very important. That part there is that now it's not about just you. It's about how you. I mean, you might feel. I mean, Blackstone might be the bottom of the chain, but there's actually another bottom further down.
Yeah.
How you've sourced, how you've done.
Yep.
How you mine. That's all very ESG. I mean, couple of years ago, I remember looking at a software that would track efficiency. Now you're tracking compliance,
Yeah.
right? And compliance go further than Blackstone in that sense. And so I don't think you'll be out of a job in the near future or very close by, because what people don't realise is a growing issue, as opposed to just fix that spot and that you're done. You know?
Growing issue and a growing expectation. I think more and more people, like I said earlier, retail investors are they're knowing what questions to ask now, and it's important for Blackstone to be able to educate those people as well, to let them know what's important, what we think is important. And we're not trying to do everything. We're focusing on 3 or 4 things that are really important to our community, our shareholders, our customers, and trying to do that well in the time that we have right now, and then be more forward-looking in some of the initiatives that we're starting to look at and bring in.
I think in that sense, the importance of ESG is right at the forefront of everything people do. I mean, going down the track of where, previously investors say, mate, I'm just interested in the share price,
Yeah.
I don't care where you guys source your stuff, just get that share price
Yeah.
up. Whereas to some degree, companies would say, yeah, look, we got to please that side of the table too.
Yeah.
But I think now it's at a point where the company says, we don't have room for that kind of thinking anymore. And they almost have to cut that off in the sense that, that they don't, that pressure that would come into the company would now just be say, oh, look, that's just not a happening thing anymore.
Yeah.
Would that be a fair comment?
Yeah, I don't think it sits in isolation, and I think good ESG practice demonstrates good corporate governance and risk management, and that can be from a financial perspective, from a health and safety perspective. So it all ties in together, and it's been so interesting for me to come on so early, where I've been asked that question about the biggest priority for us as a shareholder is the financial sustainability of the business, which is absolutely true. But I think to show that we're considerate of all the risks that could pose a danger to the project and what we're planning on doing, including ESG into our DNA so early, demonstrates that we're very mindful of that financial sustainability, and we know where we want to get to, so we're addressing some of those concerns and opportunities now to make ourselves more financially sustainable.
I think in the terms of the share price and the valuation of the company, the ESG component is definitely a part of that.
Yeah.
It's not a sort of a result of one or the other. I think it's very important now, and ESG is and I try now to talk to more and more companies and bringing this topic up, because it will be an investment decision for many people. As you've just said, you looked for that as well, right? So I'm pretty sure going down the road, it's not going to change at all, right?
Yeah.
It's actually going to be a bigger component.
Yeah. Yeah.
Look, to close off, I guess, Anna, it's a huge topic. How would you sort of put it out there to people of the importance of ESG and where it would be, and where do you see it pan out? How do you see it pan out, I mean?
Yeah. So I think, mandatory compliance is coming. So it's not there yet, but it's absolutely coming. And I think, the COP conference, the climate change conference later this year, is going to drive governments to respond to the risk of climate change. And with that will come greater expectations of companies like ours to be really upfront with how we're going to manage those risks and how we're responding to them. So, from that perspective, it's just becoming part of the everyday narrative of any type of company, any type of industry, and how they're choosing to operate it. I'd also say that, ESG is just, it's code for what's socially acceptable at this point in time. So, if you just scale it back to that, well, what are people's minimum expectations around how we're, looking at water use in a community, or how we're tracking our emissions and then trying to curtail them as much as possible, but also how we treat our staff and our employees. So, and how we attract people. If you don't have an ESG narrative as a part of your company story, you will struggle to attract and retain talented, clever people who really want to contribute beyond just their technical discipline, but feel a responsibility for the legacy that they want to leave personally in a company or in an industry. Yeah.
All right, fantastic. Anna, thank you for sharing.
No worries.
It's as I said, it's a really growing topic,
Yeah.
and yeah, thank you.
No worries. Thanks, Noel. Thanks for having me.